Hannah knelt in the temple and prayed, speaking to God about the deepest desire of her heart. She bowed in prayer, staying there as she spoke to God with honesty and urgency. The temple stayed quiet around her, holding a heavy stillness as she prayed. Peninnah, the other wife of Elkanah, stood nearby. Elkanah was also married to Hannah. She let out a sharp laugh that broke the stillness. She gestured toward the children playing near the courtyard, her voice dripping with calculated cruelty. Every word was a blade, intended to strike at the silence Hannah tried to maintain. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut, her lips moved in silent prayer, fully focused on the weight of what she was asking God for. She ignored the woman nearby and the rising insults, staying focused and unmoved. There was only the stone, the silence, and the desperate, burning need that kept her anchored to the floor. Hannah spoke the words into the silence, promising that if a son were granted, he would serve the Lord all the days of his life. She stood, the coldness of the floor leaving her skin, and walked out into the light. Months passed in a blur of anticipation. When the time came, the weight in her arms was real. A small, breathing life. She cradled Samuel, tracing the curve of his face, memorizing the rhythm of his heartbeat against her own. The journey back to the temple felt longer than the one she had taken in despair. She arrived at the entrance, the heavy wooden doors standing open. Eli waited in the dim interior. Hannah walked toward him, her stride steady despite the tremors in her hands. She stopped before the priest, looked at the boy one last time, and held him out. There was no hesitation in the movement. She placed Samuel into the arms of the man who would raise him, feeling the sudden, hollow absence where the child had been. She turned, walked to the threshold, and left him behind to fulfill the promise she had made. The temple became the world Samuel knew. He moved through the inner courts with a silent, measured pace, learning the rhythm of the heavy incense and the dust that settled on the stone. Years flowed past like water. He grew accustomed to the weight of the temple lamps and the specific scent of scorched oil that clung to the tapestries. Eli moved less often now. The older man spent his days sitting in the shade of the pillars, his sight dimming, his voice becoming a rare, gravelly sound in the vast space. Samuel attended to him, bringing water, arranging the mats. No visions broke the horizon. No prophets walked the paths. There was only the cycle of the temple duties, the flickering light of the lamps at dusk, and the long, deep silences that stretched between the walls. Samuel grew tall, his hands calloused from the daily labor, his mind tuned to the stillness. He lived in the shadow of the sanctuary, unaware that the quiet was about to shatter. The darkness was total until the voice cut through it like a blade. It was sharp, clear, and urgent. "Samuel!" The boy jolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled off his mat, his bare feet slapping hard against the cold stone floor as he sprinted toward the priest's chamber. He burst through the curtain, chest heaving. "Here I am," he gasped, reaching for the older man. Eli shifted on his bed, his eyes heavy with sleep. "I did not call you," the priest muttered, his voice thick with confusion. "Go back to sleep." Samuel turned and walked back, the silence of the temple feeling suddenly aggressive. He had barely settled when the voice returned, louder than before. "Samuel!" Again, the dash across the hall, the frantic breathing, the same sharp denial from Eli. A second time he returned to his mat, his mind racing. Then, the third call tore through the stillness. "Samuel!" He was already moving before he fully woke. He stood over Eli, shaking him, demanding to know why the priest kept summoning him. Eli stared into the dark, his expression shifting from annoyance to a sudden, rigid focus as the reality of the moment took hold. Eli sat up, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of his mat. The realization drained the Kinjema color from his face. "It is the Lord," he whispered. "Go back, and if the voice calls again, you must answer." Samuel walked back to the dark center of the sanctuary. He lay down, but he did not close his eyes. He watched the shadows, waiting. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against his skin until he could barely draw a full breath. Then, the name echoed again, vibrating through the very stones of the temple. "Samuel!" The boy stood. His knees shook, but he found his voice. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." The darkness did not retreat. Instead, it seemed to fill with a presence that dwarfed the temple itself. Words poured into the silence, detailing the fall of the house of Eli and the coming upheaval of the sanctuary. Samuel stood motionless, his knuckles white as he gripped his own arms to stop the shivering. Every word was a hammer blow, breaking the boy he had been and forging a prophet in the cold, hollow dark. When the voice finally faded, the silence that followed felt heavy, absolute, and permanent. Israel had a new voice, and the old order was already history. Years of peace gave way to a restless discontent. The elders of Israel gathered, their faces set with a singular, stubborn purpose. They watched the neighboring kingdoms, noting the strength of their borders and the reach of their influence. They crossed the threshold into the house where Samuel lived, their boots scraping against the threshold with deliberate force. "Give us a king," they demanded. Their voices were not requests, they were ultimatums. They wanted a crown to match the nations around them, someone to lead their armies and stand at the head of their assemblies. Samuel stood, his hands resting on the table, his eyes scanning the faces of men he had known for a lifetime. He saw the shift in their posture, the way they leaned in, hungry for a different kind of power. He warned them. He laid out the cost of their desire, item by item. A king would take their sons for his chariots, their daughters for his kitchens, and their harvests for his storehouses. The weight of his words hung in the air, yet the elders did not flinch. They crossed their arms, tightened their jaws, and refused to back down. The friction between their demand and the old way of life sparked a fire that would consume their unity. They wanted a crown, and they were willing to pay any price to see it forged. Samuel stepped into the center of the gathering. He scanned the rows of men, his expression unreadable. The air in the assembly was thin, charged with the static of anticipation. Then, a man moved forward. Saul walked into the open space, his head clearing the shoulders of those around him by a full span. He moved with a heavy, steady gait, stopping in front of the prophet. The crowd shifted, eyes tracking the height difference, the broad set of his frame, and the raw, physical presence he brought to the center of the circle. Doubts that had lingered for weeks seemed to dissolve in the face of his sheer scale. Samuel reached into his satchel and withdrew a horn, its surface polished smooth by constant handling. He tipped it, and the oil caught the light, thick and amber. He pressed his hand against Saul's forehead, spreading the liquid with a firm, deliberate motion. It trickled down, staining the skin. Saul remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed straight ahead as the weight of the moment settled over the assembly. A silence followed, deeper than any that had come before. The shift was complete. The era of the judges had reached its end, and a new, towering figure stood at the threshold of the throne. Saul took the throne with a force that surprised even his skeptics. His armies moved in disciplined lines, driving back the surrounding enemies and reclaiming the borders of the land. Success came quickly, and with it, a change in the way he occupied his space. He stopped walking among the people and began to view them from the raised dais of the palace. His gaze sharpened, focusing on the loyalty of his commanders and the size of his treasury, rather than the needs of the tribes. When instructions arrived from the prophet, Saul began to filter them through the lens of his own standing. He would pause, his jaw tightening, calculating whether a command would strengthen his grip or diminish his influence. He prioritized the optics of his reign above all else. During strategy sessions, he dismissed tactical suggestions that didn't bolster his reputation. He spent his evenings reviewing the reports of his victories, measuring his worth by the scale of his conquests. The crown, once a symbol of service, began to feel like a permanent extension of his own ego. He became obsessed with the impression he left on the nations, turning his back on the quiet, difficult obedience that had placed him on the throne in the first place. The camp was a hive of frantic movement. Soldiers sharpened spears with jagged, uneven strokes, eyes darting toward the horizon where the enemy gathered. Samuel was nowhere to be found. Every hour of his absence carved a deeper line of tension into the faces of the troops. Saul paced the perimeter, his boots kicking up dust, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He stopped by the altar. The fire was dying, a thin ribbon of smoke rising into the stagnant air. He looked at the men, then back toward the path, his chest heaving with the weight of indecision. The pressure of their gaze pushed him toward the edge. He grabbed the ceremonial knife from the stone ledge. His grip was white-knuckled. He did not wait for the prophet. He did not wait for the ritual cleansing. He took the animal, forced it onto the stone, and drove the blade home. The act was clumsy, hurried, and final. He stood over the altar, his hands wet with blood, watching the smoke rise in a thick, dark column. The soldiers fell silent. The air grew heavy. In that single moment of panicked ego, the authority he had built began to fracture, leaving him standing alone before a silent, smoldering altar. The smoke from the altar had not yet cleared when the sound of steady footsteps echoed across the camp. Samuel walked through the ranks of soldiers, his gaze fixed directly on the king. He did not slow down, and he did not offer a greeting. He stopped within arm's reach of the altar, looking at the blood on the stone, then back up at the man who stood before it. Saul shifted his weight, his hands still dark with the work he had done, but the defiance he carried moments ago evaporated under the weight of the prophet's arrival. Samuel's face remained stone cold. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. His voice cut through the murmuring of the camp with a sharp, final precision. "You have acted foolishly," Samuel said, his words landing with the gravity of a closing door. "You have rejected the word of the Lord, and in turn, the kingdom is torn from your grasp." The camp fell into a sudden, suffocating hush. Saul stood motionless, his mouth parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The air between them grew thin. The authority he had desperately tried to secure through his own hands had slipped away, leaving him standing in the center of a silent, watching army, stripped of the future he had been promised. Samuel turned away from the camp without looking back. He walked past the rows of soldiers, his pace steady and rhythmic, leaving the silence of the disgraced king behind him. The road ahead was long and winding, leading away from the center of power and toward the quiet hills of Bethlehem. He walked for days, his boots wearing thin against the rocky path, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The weight of the coming transition pressed down on his shoulders, yet he did not stumble. He navigated the steep inclines and dry riverbeds with a singular focus, his mind tracing the lineage of the tribes. The journey was not merely physical, it was a slow, deliberate retreat from the failures of the past. As the village of Bethlehem finally emerged from the dust of the valley, Samuel stopped to catch his breath. He surveyed the modest dwellings, the stone walls, and the narrow lanes. He approached the house of Jesse, his hand resting on the wooden gate. The air was still. The heat of the sun beat against the earth. He pushed the gate open, stepped into the courtyard, and prepared to look for the one heart that could change the course of a nation. Jesse stood in the center of the courtyard, his hand resting on the shoulder of his eldest son. The man stepped forward. Samuel looked him over, but said nothing. He did not move. He did not offer a blessing. The man stepped back, and a second brother took his place. Then a third. One by one, the 7 brothers passed before the prophet. Each held his head high, eyes locked forward, muscles tense with the expectation of being chosen. The air in the courtyard grew thick with the sound of boots against stone and the rhythmic breathing of the men. Samuel watched them all. He observed the way they held their ground and the way they turned when dismissed. Yet his expression remained unreadable. The line grew shorter. The brothers began to shift their weight, their initial confidence replaced by a growing unease. When the final brother turned away, the courtyard fell silent. Samuel leaned slightly forward, his gaze shifting from the empty space where the men had stood back to Jesse. The prophet's voice was low, barely audible against the hum of the wind. "Are these all?" he asked. Jesse looked toward the fields, then back at the prophet, his silence stretching the tension until it hummed in the heat. Jesse let out a long, slow breath. He looked toward the gate, his brow furrowing as he considered the fields beyond. "There is one more," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the rustle of dry grass. "The youngest." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. Samuel waited. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the sound of a distant dog barking near the pens. Then, a rhythmic thudding of boots approached, punctuated by the metallic jingle of a lead rope. A boy appeared at the gate, stopping abruptly as he saw the gathering. He pushed his hair back, his skin marked by the sun, his palms calloused from work. He brought the scent of the pastures with him, the sharp, earthy tang of livestock, and the dry dust of the summer hills. He stood still, chest heaving slightly from the run, blinking against the shadow of the courtyard. The household remained frozen. The brothers, who had stood tall only moments before, now stepped back, casting sidelong glances at the newcomer. Jesse looked between the prophet and his boy, his mouth opening as if to offer an apology for the intrusion. Samuel did not speak. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the boy, the weight of the moment settling over the entire house like a sudden, heavy mist. Samuel moved with deliberate slowness. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a horn, its surface polished smooth by years of use. He tipped it, and the golden oil pooled, thick and viscous, catching the harsh sunlight. David stood motionless as the prophet stepped into his personal space. The air grew dense, charged with a static pressure that made the skin prickle. Samuel tilted the horn, pouring the oil over the boy's head. It ran in rivulets down his hair, soaking into his scalp, smelling of cedar and ancient earth. Then, the shift happened. It was not a sound, but a force, a sudden, violent rush that snapped the stillness of the courtyard. David's frame stiffened, his shoulders pulling back as if he had been struck by an invisible current. The brothers stumbled backward, their hands flying to their chests, their breath caught in their throats. The heat of the day seemed to vanish, replaced by an intense, humming focus that centered entirely on the boy. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his features settling into a quiet, terrifying clarity. Samuel withdrew, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder for a fleeting heartbeat before he stepped away. The power remained, vibrating in the very stones beneath their feet, marking the end of one era and the violent beginning of another. Saul stood by the high window, watching the courtyard from the shadows of the gallery. His fingers traced the cold stone of the archway, the grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. Below, the rhythm of the palace had changed. The guards no longer stood at rigid attention. They leaned toward one another, their heads bowed, their voices a low, constant murmur that drifted upward. Saul turned his head, tracking the sound, his eyes narrow and unblinking. He paced the length of the hall, the sound of his boots echoing against the floor. Every torch flame seemed to sputter as he passed, casting long, erratic streaks of light across the walls. He stopped at the doorway, listening. The air felt thin, recycled, thick with the scent of unlit incense and stale dust. He pushed into the chamber, expecting to find the source of the unease, but found only empty chairs and the oppressive weight of silence. He walked to the center of the room, his breath hitching in his throat. He looked at his own reflection in a polished bronze shield, leaning against the wall, but he did not recognize the man staring back. He was a king surrounded by stone, yet he felt the walls closing in, inch by agonizing inch, as the whispers grew louder in his mind. David entered the throne room, his steps soft on the cold tiles. He carried his instrument, the wood smooth under his palms. At the far end of the hall, Saul sat on the throne, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the walls. The air was heavy, smelling of ozone and trapped heat. Without warning, Saul stood, his hand shot out, grasping a heavy spear resting against the arm of his seat. His knuckles were raw and white. David stopped, his pulse visible at his throat. But before he could retreat, Saul drew his arm back and hurled the weapon. The metal tip whistled through the air, vibrating with lethal force. David dropped to the floor, his body flattening against the stone as the spear passed inches above his ear. It struck the wall behind him with a sickening thud, the shaft quivering deep in the masonry. David did not look back. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. He bolted toward the heavy oak doors, his boots skidding on the polished floor. Behind him, the sound of metal scraping stone signaled that Saul was reaching for another. David hit the threshold, pushed through the frame, and sprinted into the blinding light of the courtyard, leaving the safety of the palace behind him forever. The palace gates swung shut behind a column of armored men. Saul rode at the front, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the jagged cliffs of the wilderness met the sky. He did not speak. He drove his mount hard, forcing the pace until the animal lathered with sweat and foam. As they reached the foothills, The ground shifted from solid earth to loose, shifting shale. Saul pulled his horse to a halt, the beast rearing and kicking at the air. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking into the fine, abrasive dust. He signaled his men to dismount. The heat in the valley was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders. Saul climbed the steep incline, his hands clawing at the sharp rock, his face flushed and tight. Every step was a struggle against the gravity of the terrain. He paused to look back, expecting to see David caught in the open, but found only empty ravines and the mocking silence of the wind. He gripped a jagged outcrop, his knuckles bleeding where the stone bit into his skin. His breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. He turned back to the climb, his eyes darting toward every shadow, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He was no longer leading an army, he was chasing a ghost, and the wilderness was closing in around him. Saul stood on a ridge, his eyes scanning the dunes until they burned. He shouted orders into the wind, but his men were distant, their loyalty fraying under the strain of his obsession. He paced a small circle, kicking at the sand, his movements jerky and disjointed. Every rock he overturned felt like a personal insult. Miles away, David moved through the scrub brush with a different pace. He did not run, he flowed. He found water in the deep crevices of the canyon and shared it with his few companions. When the sky suddenly bruised purple and a violent sandstorm tore across the plateau, the difference became absolute. Saul huddled against a limestone wall, screaming at the gale, his hands clutching his head as if to keep his thoughts from spilling out. He was a man drowning in his own shadow. David, Kunmai Hailai, pressed his back against a sheltered overhang, eyes closed, his breathing steady and rhythmic. He did not fight the wind, he waited for it to pass. In the heart of the desert, the king was losing his mind to the silence, while the shepherd had found the center of his own soul. The divide was no longer about the throne. It was about who remained standing when the ground gave way. Saul sat on the parched earth, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt that meant nothing. The army he once commanded had thinned to a handful of men who kept their distance. Wary of his sudden rages and incoherent commands, he looked toward the capital, but he no longer saw a kingdom. He saw only the encroaching dark. The throne had become a memory, a weight that had already slipped through his fingers. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled, and he remained slumped in the dust. The nation was moving on without him, sensing the shift in the wind. Far to the south, the horizon changed. David stepped out from the shelter of the canyon, his stride long and unburdened. He carried no spear, no crown, and no pretense. The dust of the wilderness was on his skin, but his eyes were clear, fixed on the path ahead. He did not look back at the shadows he had left behind. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had survived the fire and found his purpose in the silence. The era of the king of appearance was flickering out, and the shepherd was ready to step into the light. The crown did not fall with a sound. It simply ceased to belong to the man who held it. Saul remained in the dust, a silhouette against a fading sky, clutching at a legacy that had already evaporated. He had looked for strength in height, in armor, and in the accolades of the crowd, but these things had provided no shelter when the storm arrived. David stood before the assembly, the oil still fresh on his brow. He did not tower over them. He did not demand attention. He simply occupied the space with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years in the fields, listening for a voice that the world could not hear. The shift was absolute. People looked at the fallen king and saw the end of an era defined by pride. They looked at the shepherd and saw the beginning of a foundation built on obedience. The world had spent decades measuring greatness by the width of a shoulder or the sharpness of a blade. Now, they saw the truth. Appearances were merely the shell. Character was the core. History would remember the king of flesh, but it would follow the man of spirit. God had looked past the surface, ignored the expectations of men, and reached into the dust to find the heart that was ready. The lesson was complete.